Today on the Everything 80s podcast, the top 13 toys of the 1980s. Hey, what's happening? How are you? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie. Thanks for coming on out today. And I'm counting down what I think are the top 13 toys of the 1980s. So hopefully you agree with most of these or you have some favorites in the list, but we'll check them all out. Before we start, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. I should be there. Okay, let's get to this list. So the 80s really were a golden time when it comes to toys and pop culture and everything like that. There was an explosion of pop culture, new intellectual properties, and an avalanche of new cartoons and toys. And, you know, a lot of this is because of a topic I've covered recently called deregulation, and it has to do with Ronald Reagan and him preventing what used to be the banning of advertising to children. And when that was lifted, it opened the floodgates. And that's why we see a 300% rise in new character trademarks going into the 80s, because it was free reign on going after kids. But it did bring us some of the best toys and cartoons and stuff of all time. You may see this as capitalism and commercialism run amok, but if you're a kid growing up in the 80s, you didn't really give a crap because we were the victors in all this. The problem was there was so much that you wanted and so much that looked good. I'm surprised the second Christmas wasn't introduced midway through the year to be able to promote toys and products a second time. I mean, you can only get so much stuff. Having to wait till your birthday or the regular Christmas could make this extremely tense and nerve-wracking. What would you ask for? What was realistic to ask for? I knew I couldn't ask for the G.I. Joe USS Flag aircraft carrier, so you had to have a wish list, but still leave some room for some dream toys and hope. You never know, you might have the odd aunt or uncle who thought this will be the year and we're going all out on this kid. Again, obviously, a list like this is going to be subjective and we can argue till the cows come home, but here are what I think from the perspective of a young male human child who lived in Canada, who was still occasionally afraid of the dark. Here's what I see as the top 13 toys of the 80s. Okay, number 13, Mad Balls. Mad Balls were awesome. They were hated by parents, but loved by kids. Anything that parents rejected, kids were going to eat up with a spoon. Mad Balls were created by Amtoy in the 80s and were a series of rubber balls that had grotesque faces. They came from the same company that brought us things like Strawberry Shortcake, Care Bears, and the Popples, but they wanted something that appealed more to boys. When you combine something you can throw and bounce with gross out humor, you've got the attention of small kids, especially me. I remember getting one for my birthday from a friend, but his younger brother spilled the beans beforehand, and then my friend went nuts on his brother. But I didn't care. I still got a Mad Ball. The creation of Mad Balls is as bizarre as the balls themselves, as they were thought up during a game of hot potato. The designers thought that when the music stopped and you were the one holding the potato, what if you instead looked down and saw a grotesque face? This was the actual accidental creation process, and then all the designers had this unofficial competition to see who could draw the grossest face. The company they worked for caught on to all this somehow, and then realized they might have something here, and then realized this actually could be a hit, as they did end up becoming a massive seller. Okay, number 12, Care Bears. So I didn't necessarily love Care Bears, but I still saw them as a significantly important toy of the 80s. They made a huge impact on pop culture through the toys and the TV shows. So maybe I really actually did like them a bit. They were created in 1981 from the awkwardly named company Those Characters from Cleveland. But they didn't start out as toys, but rather for use on greeting cards. In 1983, Kenner saw the promise with them and turned them into plush toys. They then went on to dominate the small screen with 2 TV specials in 1983 and 1984, and then a full TV series from 1985 to 1988. They also had 3 feature films. Each Care Bear was a different color with a different logo on the chest, revealing their specialty power. These logos were technically called tummy symbols or belly badges, both of which are just absolutely adorable. Number 11, My Pet Monster. And I had a whole other show all about My Pet Monster if you want to check back into the previous episodes to learn more. But the idea with My Pet Monster was that they were going to make a plush toy specifically for boys. My Pet Monster was made in that same vein as Mad Balls, and that the companies wanted to make toys that appealed to boys instead of the more girl-based products they had been focusing on. And I'm using quotes here. These are their words, not mine. This was the case with American Greetings, the company behind My Pet Monster. They wanted to create a plush toy, but that had more of a menacing appeal so boys would like it. To do this, they gave him blue fur, fangs, and orange handcuffs so that he could be attached to you everywhere you went. It worked, and My Pet Monster was a huge hit. In a rare reversal, they actually would make a cartoon series after the toy came out. Up to that point, most cartoons were used to launch the toy product. I remember thinking that My Pet Monster wasn't really a doll, but was a cool toy that just happened to be plush and soft. And that was the real intent behind putting him out. And a lot of other kids felt the same way, and he would be one of the defining toys of the 1980s. They also had the cartoon show that was immensely popular and an actual live action movie in 1986, but do not check that thing out. But, if you do want to check something out, check out the episode I did that goes more into all this stuff and how all that was created. Number 10 of the top 13 toys of the 80s, My Little Pony. See, again, not up my alley, but culturally significant and deserves a place on the list. So I think I'm being pretty flexible with this whole thing. I had a younger sister, so I was all too familiar with everything to do with My Little Pony. I had to let her watch her shows before I could watch what I wanted. So I ended up sitting through a lot of these things. My Little Pony was developed by Hasbro in 1981, and the ponies had colorful bodies with a unique symbol on both sides, which would be called cutie marks. I have something similar on me. They were technically first called My Pretty Pony, and in 1982, it officially became My Little Pony. They were a massive hit right out of the gate. That's a very unintentional but funny horse pun. The toy line ran all the way till 1992 in the US and till 1995 globally. I'm not going to get into the further appeal and the growth of the brony culture because that's just ridiculous, but, if that's your thing. I mentioned at the start of this article about the deregulation and cartoons that were now being used as 22-minute commercials to push toys on kids. My Little Pony was seen as kicking off this whole thing. It was widely frowned upon to be sneakily advertising to kids through the use of a cartoon show, but nothing was allowed to stop this now. And again, it would open the floodgates with some other toys that we'll get to in a second. Either way, My Little Pony was a massive hit with the toys, TV series, and movies. It's a billion-dollar property and was another definitive part of the 1980s. Number 9 on our list, the Popples, which I mentioned earlier. It's our old friends from American Greetings back at it again with that side company, those characters from Cleveland. You probably never really heard of either of those companies compared to companies like Hasbro and Mattel, but they actually brought us some of those most significant toys of the 80s. The Popples were another such one. I thought they were actually a pretty awesome toy, and they earn a spot on my very coveted list here. The Popples were kind of half sock, half stuffed animal that were marsupial teddy bear type toys with long tails that they could fold into balls. That idea of them being part sock is actually not a joke, as the creator, Susan Trentill, supposedly got the idea from rolling up socks. She was a powerhouse toy designer and also created Strawberry Shortcake and the Care Bears. The Popples were released between 1986 to 1988 and also had a cartoon series from 1986 into 1987. There were 9 Popples in the first line, including ones such as Pancake, Puffball, and Potato Chip, which all sound delicious. There were other lines introduced over the years, but these 9 would make up the core era. And even though they were a short-lived toy, they were a very, very popular part of the 80s. And that was the thing at this stage of the toy game. When I mentioned this, like the golden age of toys, it really was, like I said, with that 300% increase in licensed products and characters and creations. there was so much out there that to stand out amongst all that took a real sort of monumental effort, and you couldn't necessarily predict what was going to happen. Like, we think of all the toys you know of and had, and there were so many that were little flash in the pans that you probably never saw because they just didn't have the staying power. They had to try anything to make a dent. Like, how are you going to stand up against some of the heavyweight toys like others we'll get to in a sec, but whether it's the Care Bears or My Little Pony, how are you going to appeal with something like the Popples? So the fact that it made a splash, even though it was for a couple years, it still had a cartoon show and you've heard of them. So they made a dent in a time where it was almost impossible to make a dent, but they were able to manage so. Number 8 on the list, GoBots. So I personally would like GoBots higher on this list as I love them, but I have to be realistic about their place in 80s toy culture. Again, with referring to what I just mentioned about trying to stand out and make a dent, even if it's a short one. Often considered the poor man's Transformers, the GoBots actually predates the Transformers by a bit, but it didn't catch on as much until the Transformers really took off. GoBots were a smaller and simpler transforming robot that started out as the Machine Robo in Japan. Tonka actually released them in 1983 as the GoBots and decided to give them something they didn't have in Japan, which was also the issue with Transformers, and that is giving them a backstory. GoBots were from the Romulus system, were made up of the good Guardians and the evil Renegades. Again, all of this including backstory, characters, names, character personalities were all developed before Transformers. So they came out in 1983, and some of the toys would include Leader 1, Psykill, and Bug Bite. They were only 2 to 3 inches high and based on very basic vehicles like simple cars and planes. A cartoon series called The Challenge of the GoBots would come out on September 18th, 1984, debuting ahead of Transformers by 9 days. I had never been so excited for something in my life, but they aired before I got home from school. So when their initial run of 3 or 4 episodes or whatever happened, I faked sick and was somehow able to stay home and watch those first episodes, which I haven't admitted till this show. And again, I did a whole other episode on GoBots and their development and the success and why, though, they ultimately lost to Transformers. So check that one out back in the earlier episodes. We are now at number 7, and that is going to be Teddy Ruxpin. This was like an alien technology that had come to Earth. A talking bear that could sing and tell you stories was pretty crazy. The tale of Teddy Ruxpin is also an interesting one too. He was invented by a guy who designed the animatronic characters for Welcome to Pooh Corner, if you remember that show, and also worked for Disney and created the giant animatronics for Chuck E. Cheese. He also did the Country Bear Jamboree, if you remember that show. Sorry, fun fact about Chuck E. Cheese. His real name, this guy actually has a whole backstory. His real name was Charles Entertainment Cheese, and he threw birthday parties because he was an orphan who didn't know when his own birthday was, and he wanted other kids to feel special on their birthday because he didn't. So, very tragic backstory. Teddy actually has a backstory himself, and he's technically considered an Iliop and comes from the land of Grundo. He would use, the toy, would use cartridges in his back to play his stories, and he went from a prototype of a head on a stick to store shelves in just 6 months. That is a staggeringly fast turnaround time, but they had to have him out for the Christmas of 1985, and it was a good thing they rushed it because he sold a staggering 41,000 units in the first 30 days and made $93 million by the end of that year. Teddy Ruxpin is one of the best-selling toys of 1985-86, and that, if you consider, is smack right in the middle of probably the greatest decade for toys in history. So again, being able to stand out and to be the best seller amongst all that other stuff shows how big Teddy Ruxpin really was. And so, yeah, check out my episode all about Teddy Ruxpin. And the creation story is pretty amazing. Again, how this whole thing was developed. And there's an amazing amount of technology that went into this thing. And the fact that they got it down to the size of the bear, considering it was the mid-'80s, like this thing should have been the size of like a small hatchback. but they were able to advance it and make it. It wasn't cheap by any means, but still relatively affordable, and an amazing piece of technology. So check out the Teddy Ruxpin episode. Number 6 on the top 13 list, the Cabbage Patch Kids. One of the hottest toys of all time, and the toy that started the concept of a toy craze as we know it. Cabbage Patch Kids came out in 1982 and may have been a stolen idea. I have a whole other show on this one. Check that out. That goes way into the backstory. Here's the basic idea. The first iterations were called Doll Babies by a lady named Martha Nelson Thomas. She would sell them at craft shows where a guy named Xavier Roberts first saw them. He would buy them and then start selling them for a lot of money. She hated this, tried to get him to stop, but he vowed he would make his own, and he did. The likeness was pretty similar, but he would mass produce them, and then they would be released by Coleco. The difference is each doll was unique and would come with an adoption certificate. They also looked more like a baby and not a horrifying porcelain doll that would come to life in the middle of the night and murder you. So they were a little more playable than just like a display thing. So you combine this new concept that's kind of unique and very appealing to kids with a very good advertising campaign, and then you throw Christmas into the mix, and you've got one of the hottest toys ever made. And the Cabbage Patch Kids craze of 1983 was really the first incidence of things like trampling and beatings and broken bones just to get a new toy. Stores were completely understocked, and thousands of people would have to be turned away. It really seems like it did set the stage even for things like Black Fridays of the future. But there was no denying the impact the Cabbage Patch Kids had on the culture. By the end of 1985, they had made over $600 million. If you convert that for today, it's over $1 billion just in that short time period. They were on the wish list of pretty much every kid going to that Christmas and the next one. Again, like I could go on about this forever. It's an amazing story of, a stolen idea, smart marketing, creating, again, more of identity and backstory than just releasing a doll. And again, the Cabbage Patch Kids riots are amazing. And this is a time before, internet and YouTube videos and blogs and sharing, and that this was able to create such a storm is amazing. We have now reached the top 5. And this one will probably surprise you, but we're looking at things that were very popular that a lot of kids had, and most houses had them even without you realizing it was ever bought or that you ever received it. And that is the Snoopy snow cone machine. Technically came out in 1979, but makes a cut as it was propelled into the 80s. This was the frozen version of the Easy Bake Oven, and one that showed you the value of hard work, because this was actually based around manual labor, but was a massively huge selling toy. You probably had one. There had been, previous snow cone toys out before, but slapping Snoopy on it made it much more coveted. The peanuts are usually associated with things, like a Charlie Brown Christmas, or it's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown. So there was an immediate association with Snoopy and snow. It was first made by Hasbro, and you would have to stuff ice cubes into the top, and you had to really crank this thing to make it work. It was kind of like churning butter, but worse. But the fact you could make your own treat at home made this a hugely coveted toy. Okay, so number 4. So if you remember us talking about with the Cabbage Patch Kids, the difference there, instead of just putting out a doll, they created more of a character and more of an identity. And again, with the adoption certificate that you would get, and each doll was unique and had its own name. And that was a smart move instead of just putting out a bland toy. And that's for our number 4, which did the same thing, and that was the Pound Puppies. So the Pound Puppies took that concept of the Cabbage Patch Kids but put it into dog form. Each Pound Puppy followed the similar adoption idea, and they would also come in these, unique little cardboard dog houses that you could carry anywhere. They were put out by Tonka, of all people, and released in 1984. And of course, these nice plush dogs with long ears and drooping eyes. And again, it wasn't just a toy dog. It was this unique dog that came with their shots. and they could be washed in water. So kids were encouraged to give them baths. They were a little more functional. There was also a successful cartoon that went with them in 1985, and the toys would make over $300 million during the 80s. And the interesting thing is that the Pound Puppies were a reaction to the video game crash of 1983. And I've touched on this a lot on the show, but this is basically when Atari went belly up. Nintendo was not yet on the scene, and toy companies who had been really burned when the video game market went down didn't want to have anything to do with video games anymore. They went back and invested in low-risk toys and traditional items like dolls, teddy bears, toy cars. They kind of went back to their roots, and that's what the Pound Puppies were. And again, the whole thing is they're not just releasing a stuffed dog, which is, pretty cool and they're cute, but they're putting out a brand of them that had character and a story behind it. This makes it easier for kids to associate and connect with the toy. And the Pound Puppies were proof of taking that simple concept but personalizing it. So you just weren't getting this thing, you were adopting it and bringing it home. It had its own name and its own little house. And again, you could take care of it and everything. It wasn't just like a stuffed teddy bear, which just sort of sits there. Okay, number 3, and it's going to be He-Man. He-Man was a dream toy to a kid like me. It's part action figure, part mythology, and a superhero all rolled into one. Here in the list, we're getting into the heart of it for the toys that were released because of TV shows. I talked about like My Little Pony and using cartoon shows as 22-minute commercials. This is where it's all coming into fruition. So He-Man and the Masters of the Universe was spellbinding for a kid like me, and is one of the few examples, though, of an original idea being launched successfully. The toy came out in 1983, but it was in development for years. They were influenced by the success of the Star Wars toy line, but if you remember those toys, they were very pretty. They were thin and flimsy. With He-Man, you got a more solid, muscular action figure, and it just felt like better value. They had one of the best mythologies of any toy, with the story of Adam from Eternia and his transformation into He-Man by the power of Grayskull. The toys were amazing, and they included characters like Skeletor, Cringer, Man-at-Arms. It also included what is arguably the greatest playset ever released in Castle Grayskull. So all in all, you've got this perfect combination of all these different aspects that made it one of the most successful toys of all time. Okay, at number 2, and you can probably see where this list is going, but number 2, G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe, of course, goes back to the 60s, but the new iteration in the 80s made it one of the best of the decade and one of the best toys of all time. Again, if My Little Pony was seen as kicking off the era of advertising directly to children, G.I. Joe took it to the next level. Put out by Hasbro, they were also influenced by the Star Wars toy line. The original G.I. Joes from the 60s were 12-inch figures with real cloths and furry heads. If you've ever seen one of those things, they could actually get moldy. That's how weird those toys were designed. So, partly due to oil shortages and the success of the smaller Star Wars toys, G.I. Joe was also shrunk down to 3.75 inches and reintroduced in 1982, just in time to have no restrictions on how it was going to be marketed. The cartoon came out in 1983 and ran till 1986. And even though it was creative, it was 100% used to market the toys. If you remember the old shows, each episode was pretty much devoted to introduce a new character or a vehicle. And in each episode, every character, watch this. I don't know if you ever watch these things back, but if you remember or check them out, whether it's My Little Pony or G.I. Joe or any of these things, every character was always referred to by their full name, as were the vehicles. This is so you knew the exact name of the toy that was subsequently being released along with it. But whatever, this worked for me and pretty much every other kid in North America and around the world. You had an amazing war hero story, versus the bad guys of Cobra, and the coolest action figures and toys and vehicles ever made. And they released a crap load of them. There were over 200 vehicles alone and hundreds of action figures, basically enough to sink a battleship. And speaking of that and battleships, they put out the largest toy ever released that I mentioned at the start, the G.I. Joe USS Flag, a massive 7-foot-long aircraft carrier. that if you owned one, I hate you. Because I don't know anyone who owned this thing. You had to be so rich first to afford it. You had to be rich enough to have a separate room just to store this thing in and to possibly to properly play with it. Not that I'm jealous, but that's G.I. Joe. And the number one toy of the 80s, and I assume you see this coming, Transformers. And was there any doubt? If you're seeing where my tastes lie, there's no surprise to this. And to me, the best toy of the 80s. It was two toys in one, and it combined all the great things mentioned in all these previous toys. There is an amazing backstory and mythology of the Autobots and the Decepticons from Cybertron, and then the subsequent cartoon that went into launching them. The cartoon started as a 4-part series to launch everything about the toys and the backstory, but then it grew from there. These toys were a kid's dream come true. They were alien robots that you could transform from robot into this awesome vehicle. They did not feel cheap, and they actually took some skill to transform. With Transformers, you felt like you could identify with the characters, and this, in no doubt, was thanks to the amazing mythology they created. Everything about these toys made them the best of the decade, and you liked the bad guy toys as much as the good guys. The notable choices like Megatron, Soundwave, and Starscream, they matched up perfectly to Optimus Prime, Ratchet, and Ironside. When they released the Dinobots, I almost passed out. Now you're just like taking advantage of kids at this point. This awesome toy, you introduced dinosaurs into it. It was like game over at that point. Again, with the backstory, again, a whole other episode on this, the amazing story of how Transformers were developed. Definitely check out that episode. But not an original idea at all. Comes from the Diaclone toy line from Japan, but Hasbro jumped all over them. They put out their new versions of the Japanese toys in 1984, along with the TV show to launch them. Again, they were just straight up 22-minute commercials, but we were never the same again as kids until Michael Bay put his filthy hands on the whole thing and the franchise. But whatever, we'll leave that alone. Okay, that's it. That's the best of the decade. Those were the top 13 toys of the 80s from my perspective. I think I had a pretty fair list. I think I covered a bit of everything. And again, I understand I probably left some of your favorites off, but maybe covered some. But I think I got that good range and explained their significance. So, as I've basically been alluding to, this was the golden age of toys. And if you grew up in it, you knew how lucky you were to have these things that really did help shape your childhood. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for listening. And if you haven't, again, already subscribe wherever you find your podcast. I should be there. Leave it a rating and review if you really liked it. Feel free to share it around with other people who might appreciate this sort of thing. But I appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show. I know there's 8 trillion podcasts out there now, so the fact you're listening to this one means quite a lot. So thanks for your time, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.